He had less than 48 hours before everything fell apart. The board vote was in 2 days. The custody hearing was the day after that. Ethan Cole sat alone on a park bench at the edge of the lake, wearing the kind of stillness that looks like calm, but isn't. Then a girl sat down at the other end without asking. She dropped her bag, stared at the water, and said under her breath, "I just got fired. I have nowhere to go." He didn't answer. But he didn't leave. That was how it started. Ethan had left the office at 4 in the afternoon, which he never did. His assistant called after him twice. He didn't turn around. He walked 3 blocks, then 6, then turned into Central Park without deciding to the way a man walks when he has stopped trusting his own decisions. He found the bench near the lake almost by accident, a flat stretch of water, catching the last of the afternoon light, quiet enough that he couldn't hear his own thoughts, which was exactly what he needed. He had been sitting there for nearly an hour when she arrived. She was young, early 20s, carrying a canvas bag that looked like it had been packed in a hurry. She scanned the benches along the path, then looked at him and at the empty space at the far end of the seat. "Is anyone sitting here?" she asked. Ethan kept his eyes on the water. "I'd prefer to be alone," he said. It was the kind of answer meant to end things cleanly without confrontation. She sat down anyway, not close, not crowding him, just at the opposite end of the bench, dropping her bag between her feet and leaning back like she hadn't sat down in hours. She didn't look at him. She looked at the water, and she didn't say anything for a long time, which he hadn't expected. The silence held. A jogger passed on the path behind them. A dog on a leash pulled toward the edge of the lake, and its owner pulled back. Ethan kept his eyes forward. Then the girl exhaled, not dramatically, just the sound of someone who had stopped holding something in, and said quietly, almost to the water, "I had a whole plan for today. It didn't involve this bench." Ethan said nothing. He wasn't going to encourage it. Sophie continued, still not looking at him. "My manager called me in at 2 o'clock. Said they were cutting hours across the board budget reasons." She set the bag on her lap and stared at the zipper. "I've been covering double shifts for 3 months straight." That part didn't come up in the conversation. There was no self-pity in her voice, just the flat accounting of someone who had already done the math and didn't like the answer. Ethan found himself saying, without meaning to, "Did they give you any notice?" Sophie glanced at him sideways. 2 days. She let that sit, then added, "You..." He almost said nothing. He had spent 4 years saying only what he had to, but the afternoon was long, and he was tired in a way that sleep didn't fix anymore, and the question had come from someone with no stake in anything. "My board is voting to remove me as CEO in 48 hours, he said. "I founded the company, built it from 1 product and 2 employees. He stopped there. He didn't need to say the rest. Sophie nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected, not about him, but about the day in general. "So we're both having the same Tuesday," she said. Despite everything, the corner of his mouth moved, just barely. That was when the conversation began to open, not because either of them chose it, but because they had both run out of reasons to stay guarded. Ethan told her about ArcLight in a way he hadn't let himself talk about it in years, not the version for press releases, not the language he used with investors, but the actual weight of it. He had started the company at 26. He had grown it into something that employed over 4,000 people. He had made decisions bad and good, and stood behind every one of them. And now he was watching it come apart in a way he didn't fully understand yet, which was the part that kept him awake at 3 in the morning, not the losing, but the not understanding. Sophie listened without offering solutions. She asked a question here and there, not to probe, but enough to show she was following. At some point, Ethan mentioned Lily, 8 years old currently with his housekeeper, because he had been in emergency meetings since 6 that morning. And if the scandal around his exit grew loud enough, and people were working to make sure it would, his late wife's family had already indicated through their attorney that they would pursue custody. They had never fully accepted him. Not when his wife was alive, not after. And now, They had an opening. He said it plainly, the way men say things they have rehearsed silently until the words stop feeling real. Sophie looked at him, then not with sympathy, which he would have found condescending, but with something more direct. "How old was Lily when her mother died?" she asked. 5, Ethan said. Sophie didn't say she was sorry. She sat with it for a moment. "So she's been watching you hold everything together for 3 years, she said. It wasn't a question. It was an observation with weight behind it, and Ethan found he had nothing to offer in response. His phone rang. He looked at the screen as attorney. He stood slightly turned away from Sophie and answered. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. The board had confirmed the vote. Official session in 48 hours. If Ethan had no documented counteraction filed before, then the outcome was predetermined. His attorney's voice was careful, measured the tone of a man delivering news he had been practicing. Ethan thanked him and ended the call. He stood for a moment with the phone in his hand, facing the lake. The light had shifted while they were talking. The water looked darker now, less like a reflection, and more like its own thing entirely. Sophie didn't ask what the call was about. She had heard enough from his side to understand. Instead, she said, in the same quiet tone she had been using all afternoon, "I lost my internship at a law firm last year. Not fired, just not renewed. I had been there 8 months. I was good at it. My supervisor told me on a Friday at 5 o'clock, and by Monday morning the position was already posted online. She wasn't drawing a comparison. She was just saying, 'I know what it looks like when the floor moves without warning.'" Ethan sat back down. "The thing I kept coming back to," Sophie said, "was whether I had missed something, whether there had been signs I wasn't reading." She looked at the water. "I don't think there were. I think some things happen because someone else decided they were convenient, and you get handed the result without ever being part of the conversation." She stopped there. She wasn't performing insight or trying to sound older than she was. She was just saying what she actually thought. Ethan looked at her directly for the first time since she had sat down. She was younger than he had registered initially, not naive, but not yet worn down in the particular way that came after years of absorbing damage without naming it. There was something unguarded about the way she talked. No angle to it, no positioning. "What did you do?" he asked. "After the internship." "I went home," she said. "Then I spent some time figuring out what I actually had instead of mourning what I thought I had." She adjusted the bag on her lap. It took longer than I expected, but it was more useful than trying to change something that was already done. The lake was almost still. Somewhere behind them a child was laughing at something pure, uncomplicated from the stomach. Ethan had been in this park for over an hour, and this was the first time he had registered any of it. Then Sophie said it. Not like a lesson, not like someone who had been building toward it, but the way you say something when you're still deciding whether it's true. Your daughter needs a real father, not someone who only knows how to be afraid of losing. Ethan didn't respond. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like either agreement or deflection, and he didn't want to do either. He stayed on the bench as the light continued to shift over the water, and the city moved around them, the way it always did. Indifferent, continuous, entirely unaware that something had just changed. He just didn't know what yet. The story broke at 7 the next morning. Ethan was in the kitchen making coffee when his phone started moving on the counter, notifications stacking before he could read them. He picked it up and saw his own name in a headline, "ArcLight CEO under fire as leadership crisis deepens." Then another. Then 3 more. The language varied, but the substance didn't. Unnamed sources close to the board, concerns about strategic direction, questions of confidence. Whoever had fed this to the press had timed it precisely the night before the vote, early enough to shape the morning cycle late enough that Ethan had no time to respond before the narrative set. He put the coffee down and called his head of communications. The call went to voicemail. He called his COO. Same result. He sat at the kitchen table for a moment, phone face down, and listened to the apartment. Lily was still asleep. The housekeeper wouldn't arrive for another hour. The city outside the window was already moving, already loud, already indifferent. By the time he reached the office at 8:32, board members had declined his meeting requests without explanation. His assistant handed him a printed summary of the morning coverage without making eye contact. And Victor Hayes was already there, standing at the far end of the conference room, with two board members Ethan recognized, speaking in the low, comfortable register of a man who had been expecting this day for a long time. Victor was 61, silver-haired, and had a talent for being present without appearing to want anything. He had been ArcLight's co-founder in title, but not in practice. He had provided early capital-made introductions, and then largely stepped back as Ethan built the company into what it became. For years, the arrangement had felt clean, functional. Ethan ran the company. Victor collected the returns. Now watching him stand in that conference room with the easy posture of someone who had already counted the votes, Ethan understood that the arrangement had never been what he thought it was. Victor looked up, saw Ethan, and nodded once, friendly, measured, the nod of a man who had nothing to prove. Ethan went to his office and closed the door. The meetings that day were the kind that told you everything without saying anything. His general counsel was available but careful. His CFO was present but non-committal. The executive team showed up where required and said what was necessary and offered nothing extra. Ethan had spent 4 years building a culture of directness. He had believed he had it. What he was seeing now was what remained. When the pressure finally came, people doing the math on their own positions and landing reasonably on caution. He couldn't blame them. He didn't. That evening, after the office had emptied, Ethan sat with a private investigator he had worked with twice before on corporate matters, a methodical man named Gary Sims, who charged too much and delivered exactly what he said he would. Ethan laid out what he knew and asked Gary to find what he didn't. Gary listened, asked 4 questions, took no notes, and said he would have something in 48 hours. Gary came back in 36. The finding was this: 18 months earlier, during a round of restructuring, a new strategic partnership agreement had been drafted and signed a document Ethan had reviewed and approved covering standard terms around revenue sharing and board governance. Buried in Section 14, in language that had been carefully softened to read as procedural rather than punitive, was a clause allowing the board to temporarily suspend executive authority in the event of, as the document phrased it, a materially significant reputational risk. The clause had been proposed by Victor's attorney. It had been included without discussion, and for 18 months it had sat there, inert, waiting. Ethan read the clause 3 times. Then he set the document down and understood. Not with anger, which would have been easier, but with the cold, clarifying recognition of a man who has just seen the architecture of something that was built around him while he was looking elsewhere. Victor hadn't moved against him impulsively. He had constructed the mechanism first, and then created the conditions to use it. The media leak, the board pressure, the carefully timed erosion of confidence, none of it was spontaneous. It was a sequence. Gary Sims delivered his full report that same afternoon, billed his hours, and told Ethan directly, "What you do with this is your call. I've taken it as far as the paper trail goes." He shook Ethan's hand and left. The investigation from here would require a different kind of work, the kind that Gary couldn't do. The goal was no longer to survive the vote. The goal was to prove what had been done, and to do it before the custody hearing, because if Ethan was removed from ArcLight under a cloud of manufactured scandal, his late wife's family would use every line of that coverage in family court. He knew this with certainty. Their attorney had been sending signals for weeks. He needed a witness. Someone inside Victor's operation who had seen something, questioned something, and been removed for it. He called Sophie. She picked up on the 3rd ring. He hadn't planned what to say, but she didn't wait for a formal opening. "I've been following the news," she said. "Are you okay?" Ethan told her. No, he wasn't, and then asked her directly. During her internship at the law firm, had she ever encountered anything connected to Victor Hayes or his holding company? There was a stretch of quiet on her end, not the quiet of someone stalling, but of someone actually searching their memory. Then she said, "There was a name that came up once, a guy who used to work in Victor's finance division. One of the junior analysts mentioned him, once said he'd been let go suddenly after asking questions about a contract." She stopped. "I don't know anything beyond that. But I remember the name because it was around the same time I was trying to figure out if the firm was worth staying at." She told him the name Daniel Walsh. Ethan wrote it down. Gary had already handed off his files, but he had included a contact directory as part of his final report. Using those leads, Ethan located Daniel Walsh in 2 days. He was living in Philadelphia, working as an accountant for a mid-sized logistics company, and had changed jobs 4 times in 3 years. The pattern of a man who didn't want to be found by the right people, or possibly by anyone. Ethan had a phone number and a current address. Ethan called. Daniel picked up, heard Ethan's name, and went very still on the line. Ethan could hear it, the particular stillness of someone who had been waiting for a call they didn't want to receive. "I know why you're calling," Daniel said. His voice was flat controlled. "And I'm going to tell you what I told myself 3 years ago. I'm not doing this again." Ethan asked what he meant. Daniel said, "I saw something. I reported it through the right channels the way you're supposed to. Nothing happened. I got walked out of the building on a Thursday afternoon, and by Friday, my access was revoked." He stopped. "I have a job now. I have a lease. I am not going back into whatever that was." Ethan didn't push. He thanked Daniel and ended the call. The same afternoon, he requested a full extraction of internal communications from ArcLight's server, specifically emails from the period surrounding the drafting of the partnership agreement 18 months earlier. His IT director processed the request and came back 2 hours later with an apology and a technical explanation. The relevant archive had been flagged for deletion 6 days ago under a routine data management protocol. The deletion had been approved by someone in the compliance division. The emails were gone. The timing of the deletion 6 days ago, the same week the board vote was announced, was not a coincidence. Ethan knew this the way you know something you can't prove yet. His attorney called on a Wednesday morning to inform him that Lily's maternal grandmother had filed a motion to accelerate the custody hearing. The court had granted it. The new date was 5 days out from that call. His attorney's tone was the careful, even register Ethan had come to associate with bad news being delivered professionally. "The current media environment is not helping us," his attorney said. "If the board vote proceeds as expected, the other side will use that coverage as evidence of instability. We need the narrative to be different by the time we walk into that courtroom." The board met the following evening as scheduled. Ethan attended. He sat at the table and made his case calmly without theatrics, presenting what he had found about the clause and the sequence of events that had followed. The board listened with the particular attentiveness of people who have already decided. When the vote came, it was 7-3. Ethan was suspended from executive authority, effective immediately pending a formal review. Victor Hayes was named interim CEO. The session lasted 40 minutes. On the way out, one of the 3 dissenting board members caught Ethan's eye and gave him a look that meant, "I'm sorry. I didn't have enough to hold the room." Ethan drove back to the office, collected the photograph of Lily from his desk, and left the building. He sat in his apartment that night with the photograph on the table in front of him and thought about what his attorney had said. The narrative needs to be different. He thought about the clause that deleted emails, Daniel Walsh's voice on the phone. He thought about what it would mean for Lily if he pushed forward and lost publicly 8 years old, already missing a mother. She only half remembered watching her father's name on news sites she wasn't supposed to be reading, but probably was. He picked up his phone and called Sophie. She answered quickly. He told her about the board vote, about Victor's appointment, about Daniel's refusal, and the deleted emails. He said it all in sequence without drama. Then he said, "I'm thinking about stopping, going quiet, letting everything settle. At least Lily won't have to watch me lose in public." Sophie didn't respond immediately. He could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, steady and unhurried. When she spoke, her voice was the same as it had been on the bench, direct without performance. "Okay," she said. "I hear you." "Then, can we talk in person tomorrow?" It wasn't a question exactly, but it wasn't a demand either. It was the voice of someone who had already decided something and was offering him the chance to be part of it. Ethan looked across the room at the framed photograph on the shelf, Lily at the beach 6 years old, laughing at something outside the frame. Her mother had taken that photo 3 months before she got sick. "Yes," he said. "Tomorrow." He set the phone down and sat in the quiet apartment for a long time, not sleeping, not thinking in any ordered way, just present with the weight of what the next few days would require, and what it would cost, and whether he had anything left to spend. Sophie was already there when he arrived. She was sitting in a coffee shop 2 blocks from his building, a place without much design intention, the kind that had been on that corner for 20 years, and would probably outlast everything around it. She had a cup in front of her, and her coat still on. She looked like someone who had walked fast to get there and hadn't fully settled yet. Ethan sat down across from her and ordered nothing. He had already decided on the walk over that he was going to tell her the same thing he had said on the phone, that going quiet was the rational choice, the protective choice, the only choice that guaranteed Lily would not watch her father destroyed in a public forum, and that he needed her to understand why that was the right call, even if it didn't feel like it. Sophie listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she set her cup down and looked at him directly. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said yes. She said, "If you go quiet and Lily grows up and eventually finds out what happened, what do you think she'll believe about you?" Ethan started to answer. Sophie kept going. "Not about the company, not about Victor, about you specifically, the decision you made." She wasn't raising her voice. She wasn't pushing. She was asking in the same straightforward way she had asked everything, like the question had an actual answer, and she was genuinely curious what it was. Because she's going to find out eventually. She's 8. She's going to be 18. Then 25. And at some point she's going to look at what happened and try to understand who her father was when things got hard. Ethan said nothing. He was listening in a way he hadn't listened to anyone in a long time. Sophie said, "If you go quiet now, she's going to grow up thinking that the truth matters less than staying safe. That when the cost gets high enough, you put your head down and let it go." She wasn't accusing him. Her voice was even matter-of-fact. Maybe that's a lesson she never has to use. But if she does, if she ever faces something that requires her to decide between what's true and what's convenient, she's going to remember what her father chose, and she's going to make the same call. Sophie picked up her cup. "Is that what you want to teach her?" Ethan walked home in silence. He put Lily to bed himself that night, read her 2 chapters of the book they'd been working through, waited until she was fully asleep before he left the room. He stood in the hallway outside her door for a moment, listening to nothing, then went to the kitchen table and sat down with his phone. He called Daniel Walsh at 10:45 at night. Daniel answered on the second ring, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. Ethan said, "I'm not calling to ask you for anything. I don't need documents. I don't need a statement." He kept his voice level. "I just want to hear what happened, from the beginning. You can tell me as much or as little as you want. I'm just going to listen." There was a long stretch of quiet on Daniel's end. Then Daniel said, "Why, Ethan said, because no one did that for you the first time, and I think that's part of why you've been carrying it alone." Another stretch of quiet. Then Daniel began to talk. He had been a financial analyst in Victor's holding company for 2.5 years. He was good at his job, kept his head down, did what was asked. Then in the spring of the year, the ArcLight partnership agreement was drafted. He was asked to process a series of transfers between 2 subsidiary entities, routine on the surface, but the amounts and timing didn't align with anything in the quarterly reports. He flagged it to his direct supervisor. His supervisor told him it was a reclassification, nothing unusual. Daniel filed a written query anyway through the company's internal compliance channel because the pattern bothered him and he wanted it on record. 3 weeks later, he was called into HR and told his position was being eliminated as part of a restructuring. His access was revoked the same afternoon. He had never been given a written explanation. Before he left the building that day, he had printed 2 emails, not because he had a plan, but because something told him he should. They were correspondence between Victor's attorney and a board liaison at ArcLight, time-stamped 2 weeks before the partnership agreement was finalized. They referenced the reputational clause specifically in language that made clear it was being inserted as a mechanism rather than a standard provision. Daniel had kept the printouts in a manila envelope in the back of a filing cabinet for 3 years without telling anyone. Ethan listened to all of it without speaking. When Daniel finished, Ethan said, "Thank you." He meant it in a way that had nothing to do with strategy. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What are you going to do with this?" Ethan told him the truth. He was going to hold a small press briefing. No spectacle. No press conference in the theatrical sense. Just him, his attorney, an independent investigative journalist he had already contacted, and anyone else who chose to speak on the record. He was going to present the timeline, the clause, the logic of what had been constructed. He was going to let the facts ask the questions he couldn't ask directly. He told Daniel he wasn't required to be there. But if he wanted to be, there was a place for him. Daniel said he would think about it. He showed up. The briefing was held in a conference room at Ethan's attorney's office. A plain room, no staging a table, and some chairs, and a window that looked out onto a side street. Ethan had contacted Marcus Webb 3 days earlier, an investigative journalist who had spent 15 years covering corporate governance and had a reputation for following threads rather than narratives. Marcus had listened to Ethan's initial summary and said he would come, which meant he had already started pulling on something. There were 6 people in the room: Ethan, his attorney, Daniel Walsh, who sat with a manila envelope on the table in front of him and said very little until he was asked a direct question. Marcus Webb with a recorder and a legal pad. And 2 of Ethan's remaining executive team members who had in the last 24 hours decided that silence was no longer the position they wanted to hold. Ethan did not accuse Victor Hayes of anything. He presented a sequence, the clause drafted by Victor's attorney, the timing of its insertion, the media leak the night before the board vote, the deletion of internal emails 6 days prior. He presented Daniel's account, the compliance query, the termination, the 2 emails Daniel had kept. He laid it out the way he would present a business problem. Here are the facts. Here is the timeline. Here are the questions that timeline raises. He said he was not in a position to draw conclusions. He said he trusted the process to do that. Marcus Webb published his first piece 31 hours later. It was careful, precise, and asked exactly the right questions without overreaching. Within the same day, 2 former employees of Victor's holding company contacted Marcus independently through the secure tip channel listed at the bottom of the article. A third reached out the following morning. Each of them had a different piece of the same architecture. Each of them had been carrying it alone. The board opened a formal internal review and suspended Victor's interim authority pending the outcome. The announcement came in a single paragraph, neutral in tone, the language of an institution buying time. Victor's attorney issued no comment. Victor himself was not seen in the ArcLight offices for the remainder of that week. The custody hearing took place 2 days after the briefing, 4 days after the court had granted the acceleration motion. Ethan walked into the courtroom with his attorney and sat at the table and waited. Lily's maternal grandmother sat across the room with her own legal team composed and certain in the way of people who have been certain for a long time. The hearing lasted most of the morning. His attorney presented Ethan's history as a primary caregiver, 3 years of school pickups, medical appointments, parent-teacher meetings, the sustained daily record of a man who had been present in the way that mattered. They presented the briefing as evidence of character rather than crisis. A man who had chosen transparency when concealment would have been easier. A man who had stood in the open and told the truth when his position was most exposed. The judge took a recess. When she returned, she read her decision in the measured, unhurried voice of someone who had made it before she left the room. Ethan was to retain full custody of Lily Cole. The court noted his demonstrated commitment to his daughter's welfare and his conduct during a period of significant professional pressure. The grandmother's petition was denied. Ethan sat still for a moment after the words landed. His attorney put a hand briefly on his arm. Across the room, the grandmother gathered her papers without looking at him, and her attorney guided her toward the door. He picked up Lily from school himself that afternoon. She ran out to meet him at the curb, the way she always did, backpack swinging, already talking before she reached him. He crouched down to her level and held on for a moment longer than usual, and she led him the way children do when they sense something without knowing what it is. She smelled like school and apple juice and something that was just her, specifically her, unchanged. He held that for a second before letting go. 3 days later, on a Saturday afternoon, he took her to Central Park. It was the kind of early fall day that New York occasionally produces, cool and bright, the kind of light that makes everything look more permanent than it is. Lily ran ahead toward the water to look at the ducks, while Ethan followed at a slower pace. He wasn't looking for anyone. He wasn't expecting anything. He was just there, moving at the speed of his daughter, which was the right speed for the day. Sophie was on the bench. She was reading a paperback, one leg folded under her coat, buttoned entirely absorbed. She looked nothing like the girl who had dropped into the seat next to him 2 weeks earlier, with a bag packed in a hurry and nowhere to be. There was a small notepad on the bench beside her, the kind journalists carry, and a pen clipped to its cover. She looked settled in a way that had nothing to do with circumstance, and everything to do with having found a direction again. Ethan stopped on the path a few feet away. She hadn't seen him yet. He stood there for a moment, aware of the exact symmetry of it. The same bench, the same lake, the late afternoon light, doing the same thing to the water. Then he stepped forward. Sophie looked up from her book. Something registered in her expression, not surprise exactly. More like recognition landing at a slightly different angle than expected. She glanced past him toward Lily, who was crouched at the water's edge, pointing at something with total commitment. Ethan looked at Sophie and said, "Can you sit here with me for a while?" His voice was easy, level, but there was something underneath it that hadn't been there the first time. Not heaviness, not urgency, something quieter than that. The particular tone of a man who is asking because he wants to, not because he needs to. Sophie looked at him for a moment. Then she moved her book to her lap and shifted slightly on the bench, making room. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Lily came running back up the bank a few minutes later, breathless with something to report about the ducks. She stopped when she saw Sophie assessed her with the frank, open curiosity of an 8-year-old, and then sat down between them on the bench without being invited. She picked up Sophie's book, looked at the cover, and asked what it was about. Sophie told her. Lily considered this and said it sounded okay. Sophie said she thought so too. Ethan sat at one end of the bench and watched the light move on the water. No promises had been made. No conclusions had been reached. The board review was ongoing. ArcLight's future was still unresolved. His attorney had already mentioned the next set of proceedings that would follow. None of that was done. But for the length of a Saturday afternoon, the three of them sat on the same bench, in the same park. A man who had stopped pretending that control was the same thing as safety. A girl who had nowhere to be and had made that into something honest. And a child who was pointing at ducks and asking questions and taking up exactly as much space as she needed. Nothing announced. Nothing concluded. Just a beginning, sitting in the light in the only way beginnings actually arrive.